to introduce myself. Okay. I'd like to let everyone know my name is Seth Hyman, and I am the chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council, and that is a committee of the Jewish Federation here in Orlando. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the JCRC very briefly before we get started. The JCRC has four missions, kind of like a table with four legs. The first leg would be helping to strengthen the bonds within the Jewish community here in Orlando, between people, between agencies, between groups. The second leg would be helping strengthen the bonds between the Jewish community and other communities, whether ethnic communities, religious communities, the business community, the political class, or the political community, elected officials and whatnot. And everyone, please mute your Zooms, please. The third is that we help to fight anti-Semitism. And the fourth is that we are advocates for Israel. And so the JCRC has been in existence for quite some time. And most major cities in America with federations have JCRCs. If you're interested in learning more about what we do as a committee, we're on Facebook. And that Facebook address is just facebook.com/OrlandoJCRC. And you can just follow us on there. Okay, that's a little bit about the JCRC. Now, briefly, we have a very special guest today, and I'd like to introduce him, Under Sheriff Mark Canty. If you could unmute yourself, please, sir. Welcome.
Good evening. Thank you.
So I would like to introduce you to the group here today. Under Sheriff Mark Canty of the Orange County Sheriff's Office is actually from our community. He is from Pine Hills and went off to college at Northwestern University and then returned back to Orlando after college. He served in the Orlando Police Department for 20 plus years and was appointed deputy chief in 2017. One of his primary focuses is devotion to improved community and police relations here in Orlando. And thankfully, over the years, his community involvement has included strides that have been just as important as those that he's made in fighting crime. So we want to welcome very briefly Under Sheriff Mark Canty to our event to have a little discussion about what has happened recently in the last week.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to come to speak to the Jewish community. I do want to say thank you to the Anti-Defamation League. They supported us and provided us a great deal of information over the last week about the incident that occurred here. So thank them very well. They're a great partner for law enforcement. On January 29th, 2022, our intelligence agents and patrol deputies were notified that there was a protest occurring on the east side of town. We suspected it might be a group that has kind of dubbed themselves White Lives Matter, which had been doing protests all around the Central Florida region. We had seen them in other different counties, in Orange County, but we were quite familiar with them. As our deputies got out to this event, we did notice that the members that were there, I think there's probably somewhere between 10 and 15 at the time, had signs and swastikas, and they were identifying themselves as the National Socialist Movement, which we knew from our intelligence that was a neo-Nazi group. So they were at Alafaya, and they were protesting, saying stuff to vehicles and different people, a lot of anti-Semitic and other type terms. We also know that in addition to White Lives Matter kind of being one of the umbrellas over there in the National Socialist Movement, we also knew that the Goyim Defense League was also there as well. And I think these groups, while they're separate groups, some of their membership tends to kind of blend and cross over. So, or they show up at each other's events. So during that event, a motorist, the victim, David Neustadt, heard some of what they were saying. Obviously, it's quite disturbing for anybody to see that type of behavior. Stopped to film some of it, and somewhere during that, and I think the story that we're kind of going with is that during that he was assaulted. We think he was probably spit on. Got out of his car to confront the people, then thought someone was going to steal his car, tried to get back to his car, and then was attacked and assaulted by 3 members of the National Socialist Movement, or 3 members that were at the protest. During that time, that he also lost his cell phone, we found out later that it was picked up by one of the members and discarded. So they were also charged with grand theft. Initially, our deputies did a report for that, and then our intelligence detectives and our persons unit detectives got involved, looked at the video that had been provided to us, looked at all the information, talked to Mr. Neustadt, and were able to determine and develop charges against 3 individuals. And those individuals were Mr. Colucci, Bert Colucci, who is what we believe is the leader of the local National Socialist Movement. And he was charged with, I believe, battery with prejudice. And then there was Jason Brown, who was charged with grand theft, and Brian Terrell was also charged with battery with prejudice. 2 of those people are still in jail now. They were not able to bond out. One was able to bond out. 2 were in Brevard County, and I think 1 was in Hillsborough County. So, but I think it's important to note that this type of behavior is not acceptable, and we will put any resources that we have out there to make sure that all our community, regardless of race, religion, or anything like that, is safe to be here in Orange County. So we're here to help the community. So.
Well, thank you so much, Under Sheriff Canty. We really appreciate you coming and speaking to the group. It's obviously a gigantic impact for us and all of Orlando generally to have folks like that, standing on a street corner doing what they were doing. So we really appreciate the assistance of the Sheriff's Office in this matter. And now we'll move on. And Under Sheriff, please stick around if you'd like. If not, we thank you and wish you well. Yes, let's clap. Let's clap. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, take care. And now we move on to our main event, the headline act. Eric Ross is the Senior Associate Director for Jewish Community Outreach and Anti-Semitism for the Anti-Defamation League, the Southern Division. And I will say that we are extra lucky to have Eric here because he is also a local. Eric grew up in our community. He actually attended the Hebrew Day School of Central Florida in the past, a past iteration of what is now known as the Jewish Academy of Orlando. Also during high school, he attended Hebrew High School, which is something that brought together a lot of Jewish high school students from around the community. He became a bar mitzvah at Beth Am with our highly esteemed Rabbi Merrill Shapiro in the past. And actually, Merrill Shapiro traveled to South Florida to perform his marriage. So we're very excited to have Eric here. And we just want to say thank you and for staying involved in our community and devoting your career and your profession to advocating and protecting the Jewish people. So Eric, if you want to take it from there.
Sure. Thank you so much, Seth and Keith, for inviting me to speak with you tonight. Thank you to everyone who's joining us this evening. And thank you to Sheriff Mina and Under Sheriff Canty for all the work that they did to come to a speedy conclusion. I hope that all of you are holding up well during these trying times and that you and your families are staying safe, happy, and healthy. As Seth mentioned, I am ADL's Director for Jewish Community Outreach for our Southern Division, which includes the Florida region, the Southeast region out of Atlanta, the South Central region out of New Orleans, and the Heartland region out of St. Louis, 9 full states and parts of 2 others in all. I'm here tonight in Central Florida because Orlando is my hometown. I grew up in Longwood and I couldn't simply sit on the sidelines. With all my heart, I wanted to be here to comfort and to support this community and to remind you that you aren't alone. Unfortunately, we weren't able to hold this in person, so you'll all have to settle for a virtual hug from me tonight. What we saw in Orlando a little over a week ago is a stark reminder that no matter how comfortable we may feel in our daily lives, hate is still out there, even if we don't see it regularly or feel affected by it often. I can remember it must have been about 1994, maybe 1995, and there was a neo-Nazi rally planned to take place directly across the street from the Maitland JCC. At the time, I was your typical teenager with his chest puffed out, and I wanted to go ruffle a few feathers by counter-demonstrating, but that's not what I did. I can remember clear as day, Rabbis Shapiro, Rubinger, Adler, Elbaz, and several other amazing community rabbis during our Hebrew high classes, urging everyone to stay away from the demonstration, not to add fuel to the fire, and not to give the media even more reason to cover the incident. Instead, they encouraged all of us to attend an interfaith community rally, which I did. And for the first time in my life, I was exposed to imams, priests, and pastors who truly cared about the well-being of my Jewish community. I didn't know it at the time, but I would go on to give that exact same sage advice dozens upon dozens of times here during my professional career with ADL. When you heard the words Anti-Defamation League, I'd bet that almost all of you immediately thought of one thing and one thing only: anti-Semitism. Because yes, anti-Semitism is naturally the bulk of our focus, but it's not the only thing that we're concerned with. You see, for over 100 years, nearly 110, ADL's mission has been to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment for all. The founders of ADL, they understood in 1913 what we still fully understand today. The first half of that mission statement cannot be accomplished without the second half. Yes, ADL was created to keep the Jewish community safe and secure, but the way that we've always believed we can do that most effectively is by ensuring that all minority communities, all at-risk communities, all discriminated communities, and people of all religious faiths are also as safe and secure as possible too, because the struggles are necessarily intertwined. So today, through our 25 regional offices and 1 in Israel, ADL is the world's leading organization fighting anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred through programs and services that counteract prejudice and bigotry. And to me, that's one of the things that makes my organization so special. We have a narrowly focused mission, but a gigantic toolbox from which to address it. Now, very few people fully understand all the different ways that ADL works to create a world without hate. You see what's sexy enough to make it into the news, but you don't see what's going on behind the scenes. So I'm going to take a little time to explain ADL's work at the macro level before discussing anti-Semitism today. And don't worry, I will include a list of some things that each of you can do to help counter the rising tide of hate that we're currently experiencing. So how exactly does ADL do what we do? We start by focusing on what I like to call the ADL pie. And by that, I mean we protect, we investigate, and we educate. ADL works tirelessly to protect and safeguard civil rights in our country by advocating for church-state separation, fighting for social justice, protecting religious freedoms, and one of the activities we're most proud of, pioneering hate crime laws. We came up with the concept. It was our model legislation that almost every single one of the 46 states plus DC that have state-level hate crime legislations on the books, they used our model legislation. And it took us over 13 and a half years as the anchor organization, bringing everyone together to lobby to bring about the 2009 Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Federal Hate Crime Prevention Act. ADL also monitors, responds, and researches individual reports of anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry and discrimination. When someone is the victim of a bias-motivated assault, or their home or synagogue is vandalized, ADL is here to assist the victims in any way we can. We'll act as a liaison between the victims and the police if needed. We'll act as a liaison between the victims and the media if needed, and they don't want to be in the public eye. We'll offer guidance on the most effective ways to respond, and in some cases, we'll even help to coordinate a reward for information that can help lead to an arrest. The next piece of the ADL pie is investigation. ADL investigates like no other group you've ever known. Unlike law enforcement, we can collect and keep information on extremists and members of hate groups for as long as we like. We have an entire team of investigative researchers and analysts in our Center on Extremism who are responsible for collecting data on these people. They monitor their websites and chat rooms, and whenever possible, they provide useful information and actionable intelligence to law enforcement. When an extremist commits a crime in America today, ADL is usually already aware of that person in some way, or at a bare minimum, we already have information on their particular network of hate. For example, in late 2008, when 2 white supremacists were arrested by the ATF for plotting to assassinate then presidential candidate Obama, ADL already had huge files compiled on both of these men because our analysts had already been in other chat rooms with them where they were using their names and the same screen names and giving out identifiable information. So when the ATF reached out for our assistance, we were able to immediately confirm the white supremacist ideologies and connect their online personas with their real life identities, which aided in the speedy conviction of Paul Schlesselman and Daniel Cowart. The last piece of the ADL pie is education. We educate the Jewish community, we educate other minority communities, we educate law enforcement agencies, we educate teachers and students. We will educate anyone who can help us make a difference. Through ADL's World of Different Institutes, which includes our No Place for Hate anti-bullying campaign, we have conducted anti-bias training for over 400,000 teachers and well over 1 million students. Through our Holocaust programs, we are teaching educators, both Jewish and non-Jewish alike, how to better teach about the Holocaust. Through our Words to Action program, we're doing highly successful work with students on high school and college campuses, or those age groups and other settings, training them how to recognize anti-Semitism, how to determine the most effective responses to what they've witnessed. Because our students don't know those things when they get to college. We also do extensive trainings for members of law enforcement all around the country. Each and every year, ADL trains over 15,000 members of law enforcement in some capacity, which makes ADL the single largest non-governmental trainer of law enforcement in the country. We train them on hate crimes, on hate symbols, because they receive maybe 30 minutes to an hour of training during police academy on those 2 subjects. Many don't even understand how their state's hate crime law actually works when they first hit the streets. We train them on extremism from the far left to the far right, from political extremism to religious extremism to sovereign citizens, you name it. And we don't train them from a Jewish perspective. We train them from a, please, help keep all of us safe perspective. And we train them absolutely free. They just have to ask. So now that we've gotten through the ABCs of ADL, I'd like to explain a little bit about the work that we do to compile, vet, and quantify the number of anti-Semitic incidents occurring in America each year. Every year since 1979, ADL releases what we call our annual Audit of Anti-Semitic incidents. We use it as a barometer to help us determine if things are moving in the right direction or the wrong direction, and to help identify areas that we may need to shift our focus towards. I'll be the first to admit it's an imperfect science because it relies entirely on what people report directly to us, what information law enforcement is willing to share with us, and what we can gather from media and then independently verify. Just like other self-reported issues like domestic violence, we know undoubtedly that there are significantly more incidents taking place out there than what we know about. But we still keep doing this year in and year out because it provides us with a good assessment of the trends taking place. So please allow me to walk you through the last few years to illustrate how we use this information to identify and address these changing trends. I'm going to start off with 2017, and then I'm going to walk you through up to the most recent numbers. In 2017, the total number of incidents reported to us rose by nearly 60%, up to 1,986 from the 1,267 reported to us just the year before. In fact, 2017 was the second worst year on record at that time since we had begun tallying these figures in 1979. Every part of the country was affected. For the first time in over a decade, in 2017, we saw incidents reported in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. We also can't forget that the first 3 months of 2017 brought with them an unprecedented number of bomb threats to JCCs and Jewish institutions all over the country, with Florida being targeted more than most other states. Several ADL offices were also targeted in those bomb threats. According to our tallying, we confirmed at least 165 separate bomb threats in 38 states and 3 Canadian provinces, spanning 6 distinct waves over a nearly 3 months' time. It was later determined that 2 or 3 of these were committed by a disgruntled journalist in the Midwest who used the opportunity to be a copycat. But the overwhelming majority of these, 162 or more, were committed by a teenager in Israel with dual Israeli-American citizenship. Now, while the real motives behind those crimes may never be fully clear, the impact of his actions were crystal clear. These threats specifically targeted Jewish institutions, and they were calculated to sow fear and anxiety, and they put the entire Jewish community on high alert. When someone targets and victimizes an institution specifically because it's a Jewish institution, that is a hate crime, and that is anti-Semitism. We consider it anti-Semitism regardless of the perpetrator's religion or nationality. Now, unfortunately, things didn't get much better in 2018. There was a small 5% dip in the total number of incidents from 1,986 down to 1,879, but that still made 2018 the new third highest year on record since 1979. And when our 2019 audit numbers were released, things proved even worse. As you can imagine, 2019 included the horrific attacks of Chabad of Poway, California on April 27th, the attack at a Jewish grocery store in Jersey City on December 10th, and the attack of a Hanukkah party at the home of a rabbi in Muncie, New York on December 28th. Sadly, 2019 showed us that we had increases across the board in every major category except for one, but I'll get to that in a moment. Overall, we had a 12% increase in anti-Semitic incidents, up to 2,107. 2019 became the new single highest year on record. We saw increases in harassment, in vandalism, in physical assaults. The only meaningful area that we saw a decrease in was in the number of incidents that took place at Jewish institutions such as synagogues, Jewish community centers, and Jewish schools. There we saw a 12% decrease following a 23% decrease from the year before. Now, this can most likely be attributed to the additional security hardening that most of our communal institutions have been undergoing the previous couple of years, in large part aided by the federal nonprofit security grants. In April of 2021, ADL released our 2020 annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents. It always takes us a few months to finish vetting all the incidents before we can officially announce them. We found in 2020, incidents were reported in 47 states and the District of Columbia. The total number did decrease slightly by 4%, down to 2,024. However, this now represents the new third highest year on record for incidents against American Jews since 1979. Have you noticed this most major of all trends? Each of the last 4 years have now become new top 3. So how did Florida fare? From 2018 to 2019, anti-Semitic incidents rose 20% in Florida, from 76 to 91, despite having gone down just a little bit the previous year. And for 2020, we saw 127 incidents, a whopping 40% increase compared to 2019. In 2020, the Florida counties reporting the most incidents were Miami-Dade with 27, Palm Beach with 23, Broward with 18, and the greater Tampa Bay area saw 20. That included Sarasota, Hillsborough, Pinellas, and Manatee combined. Thankfully in 2020, excuse me, thankfully in 2020, we did see some real decreases in the number of incidents involving vandalism and physical assault, but much of that can be attributed to folks staying home and not going out during the last 9 months of the year after the pandemic had begun. For January and February of 2020, anti-Semitic incidents that took place at schools and college campuses were being reported to us at significantly higher levels than they had for those same 2 months the previous year. But the numbers dropped precipitously after March once everyone switched to online and virtual learning settings. So the numbers overall for the year went down, but had the pandemic not occurred, we probably would have expected an increase. In my opinion, the most noteworthy talking point for the 2020 audit is that the trend of decreased incidents committed against Jewish institutions did not continue. There we saw a 16% increase in that category, despite the logic that people were staying home. So let's get a little deeper. Why is anti-Semitism on the rise? Lots of people have lots of different ideas on the subject. I'm going to share with you my personal favorite 3 theories. First, anti-Semitism in many ways has been normalized. When elected officials claim that Jews use money to control Congress, or blame the country's problems on globalists, or publicly accuse Jews of invading their towns, this is the normalization of anti-Semitism. We need a zero-tolerance policy on intolerance. Second, it's social media. Look at Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, any of these services. We all use them, but with a click or a swipe, my 11-year-old daughter can find horrifying anti-Semitism that would make the Nazis proud. All because these companies, their business models rely on these clicks and swipes for their income. But it needs to end. Silicon Valley needs to step up and put action to their words and actually end the hatred on their platforms. And we need to disrupt the current clicks for profit model. And third, it's a lack of honesty. Anti-Semitism comes from all sides, but for far too long, people have been unwilling to admit that. We must all acknowledge anti-Semitism wherever it occurs, whenever it occurs, no matter what side it happens on, even when it happens on our side. I would say, especially when it happens on your side, whatever side that may be, because your voice raised in objection holds more credence than somebody else from outside objecting to that issue. Yes, we have a problem with anti-Semitism from some elements of the left, and their casual demonization of the Jewish state does lead to the demonization of all Jewish people. And yes, we have a problem with anti-Semitism from some elements of the right, with the wild conspiracy theories and the white supremacists and white nationalists who promote them. And yes, we have a problem with anti-Semitism coming from some minority communities as well. We need a large number of people from all different communities to stand up and say enough is enough. And just to be clear, for anyone wondering, yes, whether intentional or not, anyone who denies the reality that anti-Zionism is based on and rooted in anti-Semitism is also contributing to the problem. All this talk of left and right, let me expand on that for a moment. So let's take a look at the college campus today, because honestly, unless you're a tourist, a lot of people consider Orlando a college town. But in many ways, the college campus is the easiest lens with which to view this through. I'm guessing that many of you have children or grandchildren on college campuses today, or perhaps they plan to go off to college next fall. If you aren't already, you're probably starting to get nervous about the forms of hatred they may experience on campus. Now, for the purpose of this campus-centric conversation, I'm going to focus on right-wing-based anti-Semitism and left-wing-based anti-Semitism, the latter of which will mainly come disguised as anti-Israel activism. Contrary to what some people tell me it's actually a little easier to define what right-wing extremism on college campuses looks like, because their efforts mostly focus around recruiting, flyering, and the occasional rally, as you all witnessed a week and a half ago. Midway through 2017, ADL released a first-of-its-kind report about an unprecedented uptick in white supremacist recruitment on college campuses. During the 2016-17 school year, we found nearly 200 confirmed reports of flyers being distributed across roughly 100 campuses and universities. That number has continued doubling or tripling year over year over year. And it has grown so much that in 2020, we saw a spike like never before. We tracked 5,125 cases of white supremacist propaganda in 2020, which averaged out to 14 incidents per day around our country. And it appeared in every state except for Hawaii. Now, on the flip side of that coin, anti-Semitism from the left has nearly cornered the market on the mainstreaming of the anti-Israel movement in America today. That's right, I'm mostly talking about the BDS movement. For those who aren't aware, that stands for the Boycott, Divest, and Sanction movement, trying to attack Israel. Back in 2016, ADL began a joint project with the Reut Institute, an Israeli think tank. The focus of this partnership has been to create a comprehensive strategy for countering the BDS movement. The work is based on in-depth analysis of BDS efforts, both in the US and globally, so that we can identify the many ways that the BDS movement has been most effective and to outline the most effective ways to combat their efforts. We hope that our findings will ultimately complement and reinforce the excellent initiatives already being undertaken by so many other Jewish communal organizations as well. But on campus, what does it look like? Well, the biggest perpetrator of BDS on college campuses is a group called Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP. The group was first formed at UC Berkeley in 2001, and it has grown to over 200 chapters now in existence. When they get together for their annual conferences, it's amazing. They are taught the concept of non-engagement. That, you know, all of us, I can almost guarantee that every single one of you watching right now, while you are being raised, you were taught that if you have a disagreement with somebody, you talk about it with them. You share your thoughts, you listen to theirs. You try to figure out where they're coming from. You hear each other's sides. Maybe you don't come away agreeing, but at least you gain a better understanding. Well, Students for Justice in Palestine flat out refuses to engage or speak with any campus organization that is not explicitly anti-Israel, the antithesis of what we were all raised to do. Now, besides SJP, there's another anti-Israel group on campus called Jewish Voice for Peace, which plays a large role in anti-Israel campus activity. It's considered the largest and most influential Jewish anti-Zionist group in the US. There's a few others that are quickly catching up, but despite the neutral tone of its name, Jewish Voice for Peace, they actively work to steer public support away from the Jewish state. They've assumed a very visible role in the BDS movement and have worked to support divestment resolutions on college campuses and in mainline churches around the country. One trend we're especially seeing on college campuses is anti-Israel groups co-opting other social justice causes through emerging alliances with unlikely partners. Anti-Israel groups have been making a concerted effort to couch their hostility towards Israel in social justice terms, like by linking the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the events in Ferguson a few years ago, in an attempt to appeal to a broader base of support. Or student groups taking tours of the US-Mexico border to try and use that as a catalyst to discuss how Israel's security border is inherently illegal in their eyes. So what does ADL do to help with responses to situations like this on college campuses? Well, whenever possible, we will train administrators, professors, and students about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. We'll call for public condemnations of extreme activity. We'll advocate on the federal, state, and local levels for bills that that aid in the ability to keep our communities safe and secure. We share information with Jewish student groups and Hillels across the country. We arm students with research and talking points to assist them. And most importantly, through the Words to Action program I mentioned earlier, we encourage students to counter bad speech with good speech. Now, a lot of people ask how they can understand the distinction between anti-Israel sentiments and actual anti-Semitism. If you can imagine with me a graph, a continuum, along which anti-Israel activity becomes increasingly illegitimate until, at least in ADL's minds, I'm not saying anyone else has to agree with us on where this line crossing occurs, but in our opinion, at the end of this spectrum is where anti-Israel thoughts, opinions, activity crosses over that line into full-blown anti-Semitism. On the far end, legitimate critiques of Israel include criticisms that focus on the Israeli government, their policies, and their politicians. Further along on the spectrum is activity portrays a biased perspective of Israel. While you or I may not agree with the ideas being presented, this is well within the realm of reasonable discourse. The spectrum then moves to false accusations directed at Israel, such as claiming that Israel is no different today than apartheid was in South Africa. It's not easy to argue with somebody who makes up their own facts, and I don't often recommend it, but somebody could have been given wrong information. Just because somebody understands something incorrectly doesn't mean they're incapable of ever gaining a better understanding. So we don't quite consider that anti-Semitism. But finally, at the far end of the spectrum, we find anti-Israel sentiment, which does one of a couple of things, any of which cross over that line. We find anti-Israel sentiment that blames the entire Jewish people for the actions of the state of Israel. That is anti-Semitism. We find sentiments that demonizes Israel's actions as no better than the Nazis. That is anti-Semitism. We find sentiment which holds Israel to double standards that no other country in the world is held to. That is anti-Semitism. And we find sentiment which discriminates against the right of the Jewish people to live as equal members of the global community. And that is anti-Semitism. Now, our 2021 audit numbers won't be available for another month or two, roughly 2 months. But I did want to briefly address the alarming rise in anti-Semitism that we saw in May and the start of June of 2021, which was predominantly rooted in inappropriate expressions of anti-Semitism. I don't want anyone to walk away from this talk thinking that other forms of anti-Semitism from the right to the left are no longer an issue. They are, I promise you. But this was an issue of the moment that is worth exploring. Our preliminary data showed that during the 2 weeks of military conflict between Israel and Hamas in early May, anti-Semitic incidents reported to us increased by 75% compared to the 2 weeks prior to the fighting beginning. Many, if not most of these incidents appear to have been perpetrated by individuals scapegoating American Jews or Jewish institutions for the actions of the Israeli government. Over those 2 months, we saw a terrifying number of anti-Semitic acts, including harassment, assaults, and vandalism, almost exclusively focused on Israel. Focused on Israel as well as the Jewishness or perceived Jewishness of the victims. In Brooklyn, 6 men assaulted and punched 2 Jewish teenagers while one of the men yelled, "Free Palestine." Luca Lewis, a 20-year-old professional soccer player with the New York Red Bulls, was assaulted by men holding knives who asked him if he was Jewish and threatened to kill him if the answer was yes. In Tucson, Arizona, a large object was thrown through the glass door of a synagogue. Diners in Los Angeles were physically attacked by pro-Palestinian protesters who were hurling anti-Semitic slurs. In New York City, multiple Jews were assaulted in Times Square by a marauding group yelling out both anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist slurs and slogans. The Florida Holocaust Museum, right down the road in St. Petersburg, was vandalized with the words, "The Jews are guilty," with swastikas on either side. And at least in my opinion, the most disturbing act that took place here in Florida was a family visiting from New Jersey, walking down the street in Bal Harbor. A pickup truck pulled up next to them, started throwing garbage at them. They were wearing visibly Jewish clothing. And as they threw the garbage at them from the truck, they were yelling profanities like, F you, Jew, die, Jew, free Palestine. And then the offenders even threatened to get out of the truck and rape the wife and daughter. Thank God there was an innocent bystander behind who saw this taking place and got out of their car and scared the truck off, because who knows where that would have ended. According to the recent survey of American Jews and perceptions of anti-Semitism, 63% of American Jews feel their communities are less safe today than they were 10 years ago. That is not something I have ever been able to say in my lifetime. Not once. Simply put, the majority of Jews do not feel safe in America right now, and we have enough valid concerns to feel that way. And one of the scariest things is that this isn't just taking place on the ground. It's also taking place across all social media platforms. ADL documented a disturbing rise in anti-Semitism on multiple platforms during May and the beginning of June, from Facebook to Twitter to TikTok and Instagram, with messages including explicit praise for Hitler, promoting tropes about Jewish control, and demonizing all Jews. Not to mention the mountain of content you can find across all platforms calling for the outright destruction of the state of Israel and the extermination of its citizens. Our analysis of Twitter in the 4 days following the start of the outbreak of violence between Israel and Hamas, in 4 days, we found over 17,000 tweets that used some variation of the phrase, Hitler was right. Just that one phrase. You want to criticize the government of Israel? Fine. You want to criticize their politics, their policies or tactics? Fine. There's plenty of legitimate criticism of Israeli policy to go around. There always has been, just like there's plenty of criticism of American policy to go around. We are steadfast supporters of the First Amendment right to freedom of speech, and we strongly believe in constructive dialogue. But when you blame, scapegoat, target, or attack Jews or Jewish institutions as a way of airing your grievances with Israel, that's not protesting, that's not activism, that's not standing up for anybody. That is anti-Semitism, plain and simple. Now, the question I know that's on all of your minds, what can you do today to help push back against the rising tide of anti-Semitism? So let's break it up into a series of easy lifts for you. First, you can monitor activity in your community that affects the rights and fair treatment of all peoples, because your safety and security depends on it too. Remember, an attack on any religious or ethnic minority is an attack on every religious and ethnic minority. Second, don't engage in rumor mills. They only make things worse. Be sure to confirm information you find before you pass it along as fact. When you get that email saying that some business is racist or they're anti-Israel, before you just assume it's correct, check it out. I personally use Snopes.com and trutherfiction.com. There's other websites out there as well that do amazing jobs at determining the validity of these types of things. It's still 2022. We still 3 to 4 times a year, we'll get a call in the Florida office because somebody is furious that the University of Kentucky has canceled their Holocaust studies. This email has been going around for almost 15 years. And the original email was actually about the United Kingdom supposedly removing their Holocaust studies. But the email has gone so far and wide and people just take it as fact. I beg you, please check it out before you forward it on. Third, report any incidents that you see to the Anti-Defamation League. If a hate crime has been committed, call law enforcement first, of course. But then please visit adl.org/report-incident to let us know. If someone you know has been harassed or discriminated against, please urge them to reach out to ADL. It only takes a few minutes to do, but we can't help you if we don't know what's going on. And we certainly can't include it in our annual audit of incidents if we don't know it happened. Fourth, report instances of bullying or religious harassment in schools to ADL as well. The lessons of our No Place for Hate programming are so valuable. We're willing to work with schools everywhere and anywhere to counter bullying and cyberbullying. And all of our offices have full-time professional educators ready to discreetly assist you when you find yourself in that awkward situation. Fifth, you can visit adl.org to sign up for important news and action alerts so that you can stay up to date on these important issues. And sixth, you can continue your education beyond tonight's presentation by signing up to participate in ADL's ongoing Fighting Hate from Home webinar series, which we began, fortunately, back in March of 2020. And because of the timing, it has been hugely popular ever since. Now, some of you may be looking for resources that you can use at home with your children, or in school if you're a teacher, or in a religious school setting, or even at your work. And we have a wealth of items available to you. ADL's Words to Action program I mentioned earlier, that requires an ADL facilitator to come to you, either in person or virtually. But for those who that isn't an option, we have our Think, Plan, Act resource, which is a ready-made toolkit filled with activities and role-playing scenarios and practical lessons on how to counter anti-Semitism on high school and college campuses. Now, if you'd like to take a deep dive into the world of hate, ADL's heat map, that's HEAT, H-E-A-T, it stands for hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, and terrorism. Our heat map is a first of its kind, interactive and fully customizable map detailing extremist and anti-Semitic incidents around the nation. And we've backfilled it with data going all the way back to 2002. It can be filtered by type of incident, by type of ideology, even by state or zip code. You can do side-by-side comparisons. And if you'd like to focus exclusively on anti-Semitic incidents, well, we have an anti-Semitism tracker for that too. That one can be filtered down to the state level, possibly lower at this point. That's today. But what about tomorrow? What about the day after tomorrow? What does the future hold? Well, the answer really depends on all of you. It's going to come down to how all of you feel about finding, engaging, fostering, and working with allies, existing allies, new allies, and even unlikely allies. It's safe to say, as things have gotten worse and worse and worse over the last 4 to 5 years, all of us had hoped that the ugly, awful, jarring specters of bigotry and division and flat out murder by extremists that have scarred our society would have jolted the world back to its senses, that common decency would reemerge, that white supremacists would be marginalized, that anti-Israel detractors would be called out and curbed on college campuses. But that hasn't happened, not nearly enough. And in fact, in many ways, things are worse now than we ever could have imagined. But how can we reverse that tide? That's not something that can be changed today. That's something we have to work towards for tomorrow. Well, first, we need to accept a hard truth. We can't put this genie back in the bottle. We have to come to terms with where things stand today. Over generations, good people, including many of you in this Zoom chat right now, were able to push back on prejudice. You were able to push it out of the public square and into the shadows. But today, it's back out in the open. It's in our schools, it's on our social media, it's everywhere in between. Second, we must all fight bigotry and hatred with everything we've got for the safety of our communities and the country we love. And third, we must recognize that anti-Semitism doesn't occur in a vacuum. A spike in anti-Semitism nearly always means there is about to be a spike in all other forms of hatred. And the FBI's hate crime numbers every single year, when you compare them to our spikes and our trends, it always matches. when it comes to Charlottesville, where white supremacists with torches claim to be rallying to preserve Southern heritage and Confederate monuments, but it quickly devolved into shouting Nazi-era slogans like "the Jews will not replace us." It shows that there is a tremendous overlap between all sorts of ideologies and anti-Semitism. Now, to effectively move the needle, we cannot compartmentalize our compassion. That is why ADL has joined forces with our allies in the courts, in the halls of Congress, and through a myriad of public campaigns. But this is just a start. It's time for everyone to re-engage their civic muscles. I urge all of you to refuse to stay on the sidelines when others are marginalized for how they pray, for where they're from, or for whom they love, even if it doesn't appear to be your cause. Because after all, as Rabbi Hillel once famously said, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? When? When you boil it down, ADL is primarily a civil rights and educational organization. When we fight the defamation of the Jewish people and seek justice and fair treatment for all, we view ourselves as change agents, standing up for equality and freedom. We regularly deal with a host of civil rights issues that necessarily put us in a position to be doing intergroup and interfaith outreach. And we understand in our cores that people are not born hating. Hate is a learned behavior. And in the same way that people can learn to hate, if you are willing to put in the time, the energy, the care to educate somebody, hatred can be unlearned. That is why our education department produces award-winning anti-bias curriculum and shares these resources in our schools from kindergarten through 12th grade. Our children are our future, and we must teach them to embrace others, not to hate them. We must teach them to be upstanders instead of bystanders. Another aspect of our intergroup and interreligious work is through our advocacy and engagement and activism. A few years ago, for an example, ADL formed something called the Interfaith Committee on Mosques, which responds when townships or municipalities attempt to manipulate zoning or other requirements to prevent a mosque from being established in their community. Through this committee, we have filed amicus briefs along with other religious and civil rights institutions in a number of cases, usually leading to the mosque ultimately being permitted to be built. As you might imagine, when ADL initially approaches some of these Muslim communities, they're leery, if not downright skeptical about our sincerity and our intentions. But by the end of the process, we've created allies because we stood up for others in their time of need because it was the right thing to do. And it's not quid pro quo, but when you lead by example long enough, people follow suit. So for example, when a couple of imams out west, I think it was 2 years ago, made some public, horribly anti-Semitic statements that went way beyond, we saw many of our Muslim organizational partners in that area of the country going out of their way to publicly condemn and counter those statements. That's allyship in action. We have created or participated in coalitions on immigration reform, refugee rights. We've spoken out publicly on issues such as marriage equality, reproduction rights, voting rights, and the need for a clear separation of church and state. There are simply too many other examples of how our everyday work dips into intergroup advocacy to be able to discuss in one evening. But to give you a small glimpse into the enormity of that work, I can tell you that since 1947, ADL has filed well over 200 amicus briefs, friends of the court documents, in courts all around the country on separation of church and state issues, including some other landmark cases like Brown versus the Board of Education and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. The majority of these cases have strictly been church-state separation issues that impact all groups, all faiths, and all minorities. Now, in closing, I would be remiss not to mention that just last month, we celebrated the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We know that many Jews were involved in the civil rights movement, and I'm sure that many of you would recognize that iconic photograph of the famous Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marching in Selma next to Dr. King, where he later shared the famous words, "My feet were praying as I walked." But what only some know is that in some of those pictures, Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath, the president of what was the predecessor to the Union for Reform Judaism, was marching the whole way with the Torah in his hands. And what even fewer people know is that present at that same march and in some of the photos with Dr. King was Ben Epstein, then national director of ADL, and a number of ADL staff and lay leaders from around the country. After that march, Ben Epstein said, "The task ahead for the Anti-Defamation League is to smooth the road, to promote American ideals of democracy through obedience to law and through intergroup cooperation. This we will do with all the resources and experience of our more than 50 years of life, for we of all people know the evil of silence." And at that same march, Dr. King said, "Let us realize the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." It's a great quote, but the message that I'd like to leave you with is a gloss on that statement. Namely, that the arc, it doesn't bend by itself. It needs as many of us as possible. It needs all of us pulling as hard as we can to ensure that it keeps bending towards justice. This is what ADL strives to do, and I invite you all to join us. The idea of tikkun olam, of healing the world, has become very popular in the Jewish community over the past several decades. But the idea that we Jews can repair the world by ourselves, 1/4% of the world's population, it's simply unrealistic. We must do it together with others who share our values and share our visions. Thank you once again for having me here today. I share my sympathy and my support with all of you after what took place over in Waterford Lakes. As Seth mentioned, Orlando is my hometown. My sister lives less than a mile from where the rally took place in Waterford Lakes. This hit me too. We're all here for you. We're all here with you. And I thank you again for joining us for this community briefing. Good night.
Thank you, Eric. Let's all clap for Eric. Thank you all so much for joining us. Again, this program was brought to you by the Jewish Community Relations Council, which is a committee of the Federation. And just to wrap things up, I wanted everyone to know that unfortunately, some of the members of some of these hate groups that we've been seeing recently locally, these neo-Nazi groups or the Goyim Defense League, as they're called, and other groups, unfortunately, a couple members of those groups have moved or do live in Florida now. And they may have moved here, or maybe they've just been here before, but it's becoming more prominent. This is not going away for our community. So I ask each and every one of you to get more involved in our Jewish community, take a more active role as much as you can. Being passive is comfortable, but unfortunately, because we're seeing such a rise in anti-Semitism locally and so many hate-filled people who are out to say horrible things about Jews, we need to participate in our community agencies, and our groups. And as well, if we in our own lives hear statements of bigotry, whether it's against Jews or other ethnic groups, other minority groups, other religious groups, it is a requirement for you to speak up. Speak up on behalf of everyone. If you hear it, you have to say something. If you see something, say something, and it really will come back. It helps our community, and it helps the world. So thank you so much for joining us, and that will wrap up the program, and have a great night. Take care.
Wait, before you go, I don't have anyone's contact info. Is there a way that I can get this video?
Yes, anyone who wants to reach out to me, my email is sethhyman@hotmail.com, SETHHYMAN@hotmail.com.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Representative Escamani, for being on here tonight, too.
Yes, thank you very much.
Such an honor. Thanks so much for hosting this. Appreciate y'all.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.